Greetings. I'm David Johns, the Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition.
George Johnson, writer, activist, author.
Wadey Grant, blogger of the G-Listed.
And we thought it important in acknowledgement of National Gay Men's HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, which happens annually on September 27th, to sit down and have a candid conversation, brother to brother, about issues related to, but not exclusive to HIV, but really about how it is that as Black people, we should do a better job of having conversations that are often uncomfortable, and that seldom do we have. So a couple of stats just to get us grounded. In 2016, gay and bisexual men accounted for 67% of the total new HIV diagnoses throughout the United States and 6 independent areas. What we should be all clear about is that since the introduction of the HIV epidemic in the late 80s, Black people have and continue to be disproportionately impacted. When we think specifically about the experiences of Black men, those of us who are gay, bisexual, or same-gender loving are disproportionately impacted within our community. And so it's really important for us as we think about living in a world with no HIV, living in a world where we do a better job of supporting individuals who are thriving with HIV, to have conversations about how that specifically affects us within the Black community. And so I have a couple of questions, but we're just going to have a discussion with my brothers. And the first one is a grounding one, and it's why should Black people, Black men, and then specifically Black gay, bisexual, same-gender loving men acknowledging the Awareness Day care about National Gay Men's HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, or really care about HIV more generally? What would be your answer to anybody in our community who is wondering why they should care?
I think we should care because it's an issue that affects all of us. When you're Black and gay, from birth, you're a risk, literally, you're born into risk factors simply because of how the epidemic has kind of fallen upon our shoulders. We know once the epidemic stopped being something that predominantly affected white gay men or white people in general, things shifted in terms of the conversation, in terms of how people felt connected to the epidemic, in terms of how people wanted to even be involved within the epidemic. We know that in our community it's still very taboo. It's still not one of those things that people like to talk about. Even when talking with certain family members, they'll just say oh yeah, I know so-and-so is sick, or they'll use sick and they won't necessarily say HIV. And there are times where I'm you can say HIV or you can say I have HIV, and they're oh yeah, I know. And I'm it's okay. It's one of those things that you have to kind of push people to do. But in caring about HIV, you care about the community at large, because we know HIV doesn't just affect Black gay men, even if the portrayal of it is that. It affects Black women, it affects Black men, it affects all of us. And it's a community health issue and a social justice issue.
Appreciate that. Same question to you. What would you say to folks who are why they should care?
I agree with really what George said, and to add to it, or just even to bring it to where we are today, many people who we know in our daily lives are affected by HIV and AIDS. I could say for me personally, it's been 20 years being HIV positive. Happy 20th anniversary, but no.
That is noteworthy.
Well, but you know what? It's more to than just that is, making sure I do live a long and healthy life with it. And that's part of, why we need to have these kind of conversations, because not only it's around us, it's all over our community and in our social spaces, but also too, we need to talk about if we are affected, infected, whatever word you like to use, how do you live a long and healthy life? It's not over. I remember when I contracted it or when I was tested for it in 1999, I thought my life was over. 20 years later, I'm still here. Still look younger than my age. Still got great skin, a little bit bigger, but but realness, that's just what it is. Yeah. It's our reality, just like many other things, but this is one of them.
Yeah. You both have said things that I want to push a little bit on. Wadey, you talked about representation and showing up as a black man who is HIV positive. And I keep saying that it cannot be the case that the only person we know who is a celebrity who is living and thriving with HIV is Magic Johnson. But sadly, we still live in a world where that seems to be the case because there are very few people that are disclosing their status and otherwise talking about what's required in order to thrive. And so I want to invite both of you to talk about how important representation is and how you think about showing up in public spaces, talking about things that are very personal and intimate. And then specifically, George, you talked about the language that you have to develop in order to have conversations with your family. And something that I want to acknowledge is not easy is that often, the CDC has a lot of campaigns, many of which we support. Start Talking Stop HIV is one of them. But it is often a difficult thing, an uncomfortable thing to have conversations about sexual health and wellness more generally, let alone status more specifically. So if you could also both speak to how it is that you have conversations, not only with your families, but with potential partners, to the extent that we want to make some of this stuff real.
I think it's interesting because no matter how many times I've publicly written about being HIV positive, I'm always disclosing, because everybody doesn't know that, no matter how public I am. And I think it's also interesting when you talk about how Magic Johnson is still the most famous and kind of the only
alive and famous too.
Yeah, besides I believe Greg Louganis as well but clearly not as known to the world as Magic Johnson is. And so when I think about it, especially with my growing platform and I have a lot of followers now, and it just with the work I do, I'm going to continue to be more in the media eye. I often think about one day I'm going to tweet about having HIV and it's going to become a national news story because the people who just started following me at, let's say, 100,000 followers or 200,000 followers aren't going to know that or didn't know that. Right. And so it is something to be said about when you kind of take on that fight as okay, I'm going to be a growing media person, but I also want to advocate for HIV and be representation of what the epidemic looks like now and how we kind of start to shift the conversation, shift the language, and be able to even have open discussions about it without people cringing or people being afraid to talk about it. I still have a lot of friends who are black and queer who text me, even as recent as yesterday, hey, I haven't been tested in a couple of months, can you go with me? And it's of course I'm gonna go with you, but it's still scary to even think, as public as I am and as much as I talk about it, still some of the closest people to me still aren't comfortable enough around their sexual health to even go it alone or feel comfortable in that. And so I think it is just a lot of, bridges we have to kind of keep building within community to kind of get the epidemic and, like you said, language and people to be comfortable with even talking about it.
Wow, it's hard to follow up with that because you look at George and I. We're both writers. We both write about experiences about just people who are black, gay, queer, or bisexual, same gender loving. And we talk about all kinds of aspects of where we are in life. And even when we talk about our own stories, it just happens that HIV is just a part of our story. It's not what defined us. I remember when I not came out, but when I was tested positive, I just remember during that time, just in the black, gay, queer community, that HIV did define you. And so as far as speaking about my own personal experiences as a now newly, or at that time, newly HIV positive or been it for a few years and such, I did not want to be a part of support groups or be an advocate for it or anything like that because I did not want that to be the definition or define publicly, this is Wadey Grant, this is his voice, this is his platform. I knew I was much more than that, and that's how I always saw myself before and since. So now in 2019, I'm glad that we have so much more visibility, even beyond, we say Magic Johnson, but even within our own community, we do have powerful voices. We have George here, we have me here, and there's so many other people who have told their stories, and it's very important. But when we talk about talking to our friends and family, wow, that was really challenging for me because talking it to my family, I would say it was much harder. Uh, Not to like go into very good long details. Y'all know I like to talk long. But in short, it was painful because I found out 2 years before my grandmother passed away, who was my caregiver. You know, she raised me, reared me, and I knew she loved me unconditionally. And this was the one thing I just didn't want to tell her, you know, before she passed. So I told her in her deathbed, not sure how she responded to it, of course. But then when it came to my family overall, when it first got to my family, it was outed because I confided to a former best friend. And the former best friend told, that person told, and then it got to my family. And it crushed me, even though it also lifted a weight upon me because of I was going through health problems right before the time I was outed that attributed to not taking care of me being positive at that time. And then as far as dating and love life, it was something that I could talk about with dates. I didn't talk about it with everyone like like we feel like we should have, but especially early on. Nowadays, yes. Or for a long time, yes. But in my early days, I was just so ashamed. It was that whole stigma of, you were basically untouched, you're not to be touched, even within our own community. So
let's stay in that space. If you could do two things for me, say more about why, of all the things that you were afraid to share, disclose, I would say invite your grandmother into, why was your status the thing that you were most concerned about? And then say more about having conversations with partners. Okay. Are we at a better point in time now with regard to stigma and shame? And how do you approach what to say, when to say it, and how to say it?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. Okay, so my grandmother part is easier. I can't speak for everyone, but those people that you love the most, that you knew just loved you unconditionally, those were the people, few in my life, that I mostly never wanted to disappoint. And so for me, I felt like that's a disappointment. I didn't even really come out as gay at that time because I was, about to turn 23, 5 days before my 23rd birthday, which wasn't such a great 23rd birthday when I learned of my HIV status. And and at that time, I say according to everyone else's definition, I was gay, but I was still figuring myself out. So I didn't really have an identity until years later. So I didn't come out to her as gay, let alone come out as HIV positive. And then even people probably still think that way in 2019, but even back in 1999, people believe that being HIV positive was a consequence for being a homosexual, or you're more than likely than anyone else. This is before we even talked about women catching it and how prevalent it is in the Black community, regardless of your identities. And then as far as talking about it with lovers or just even potential partners, I have to really be very honest. When it came to one night stands, no. It just wasn't a thing. It was just, I just made sure I protected myself, to be fully honest in that. This is my first time even saying it publicly. But outside of that, for anyone who I considered a potential, I didn't disclose it with everyone, but most. But nowadays, like for the better part of 10 plus years, yes. I mean, not at this time, but even up until, let's say, about 4 or 5 years ago, I had some shame about it still, just internally. Because one, I just didn't want to feel like disclosing to everybody, especially for somebody who's been what I call chronically single. So that means I have to disclose it to another one and another one and another one. But even to this day, and to just give advice to everyone, should the stigma be gone as far as disclosure, whether it's to our loved ones or to the people we date, I say it should. Is it? It really depends on the individual. I mean, to be honest.
Yeah, that's fair. I keep saying that so many of us continue to die from shame and stigma, and that doesn't have to be the case. Same question to you, George. Do you feel that we are in a better place than we are now? And then how do you approach, or if there's language that you found that works when talking to partners, would you share it?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say, of course, we're in a better place than we were at the height of the epidemic, and I think progress is still being made year after year in terms of HIV. I think one of the bigger issues is that people don't fear the virus as much as they fear the stigma from the virus. Mm-hmm. So you have a lot of people who aren't afraid to contract the virus, but then living with the virus becomes the issue, not even like being fearful that I may contract it. And part of that is the effect that Magic Johnson had by surviving this long. And by, it's a catch-22 because when you see people who are HIV positive thriving, it makes community less afraid of the virus. They just still stay afraid though of when you see the comments and the shaming that still goes on publicly around people who are HIV positive. In terms of disclosure, I don't have an issue with it, and I haven't had an issue with it in a while. I publicly, even on like if I have like dating profiles on like Tinder or like Jacked or yeah, because I don't use Grindr.
We might come back to that.
I'm like, I don't use Grindr because race it's a whole racism issue. It's a whole racism issue on Grindr that I don't run into or Jack. So, but I public like already within my profile it says that I'm HIV positive. So
Just get it out of the way.
yeah, it's just already out there. It's public, and again, it's already public knowledge. Like if you Google me, it's gonna come up that anyway. So like, there's really no fear for me in saying it. I'm pretty, even if I'm dating or go on a date, it probably would come up. It does come up like on first dates because our community, it's a topic we talk about in our community. Mm-hmm. But I do think that that's part of like the newer generation of us that have come along through the epidemic and who are advocates or not allies, but advocates and activists within the epidemic now, because when we came into this, that was like more of a period of discovery. So it's like as we're exploring gender and identity, HIV also became something that we weren't afraid to talk about publicly, whereas, generations prior, it was still kind of like a issue you didn't really want to bring up so much. And I think our generation has less of a connection to the Black church than the prior generation. And so I think that also has kind of shifted the needle in how much further we can push HIV work now, because less of us are connected to the stigmatizing institutions that stopped us from talking about it and stopped so many of us from being public and with who we are and what we do. And so, yeah, I think that's where we kind of are right now, making progress. And now you even have churches that have HIV testing and ministries. And even my grandmother's church has an HIV ministry. So, yeah.
That's
So, yeah.
right there.
Let's stay in this space and acknowledge that for so many Black boys for whom the rainbow is not enough, that you are a mirror and a window into what's possible. And that we have the benefit of folks like Magic and others who are pioneers so that we can stand in this space. What advice would you give to a young person, a young same-gender loving man who knows you based on your public profile, and who gets tested, maybe he sees this, he gets tested, and he's HIV positive, and is sitting with the shame and the stigma and the things that society usually says? What would you want to say to him?
Again, that's another interesting question, because I have actual mentees. When I was doing work with Black Gifted and Whole with Guy Anthony, we had 6 mentees, and I still keep in contact with many of them, but one specifically, our first ever mentee, graduates from this year. So I still talk to regularly, and I actually gave his first HIV test because I was the head of testing and counseling in Washington, D.C., and this was when he came back from break. He needed to get tested, and I was the one who did his test, and it came back negative, but it came back negative. But that was when I had to have like that first conversation even with him around HIV and stigma and being more aware and, getting tested regularly. And so what I always say to younger kids, because I get DM'd all the time from newly diagnosed people because they see my profile and I talk to them through it. And I also get DM'd often by parents of newly diagnosed individuals. I recently, a woman who I used to work for at Capital One when I was in college has just been following me all these years, and sent me a message 2 weeks ago asking questions around HIV. And so what I always say to younger people, especially like you said, like newly diagnosed, is that, like it's a process. Like no matter how hip or how far the movement is gone or how we may look cool, thriving, and no matter how many slogans, it's still a process. And getting that diagnosis is still a thing that just feels like you're disappointed, because like you're disappointed in yourself, and you don't want to disappoint others, and you kind of go through that process like better, the risks a lot of times. And so it's like not to just be so heavy on yourself, to know that there were a set of conditions before you got here that placed you in this predicament. And so like the full weight of this isn't on us, because there are just conditions out there that no matter, even if you're the best and the safest, it can still happen to you. And so to just like keep reiterating like that this is just one of those things that's a system just like anything else, and that there's treatment. And I always tell them like, well, look at me. Like always remember, like you can always look at me and you can always ask me anything, but like look, like I can name people who are also out here who are doing well and who take their meds and going through the process with them, like always letting them know that there's somebody with them to go through the process, has always been like the thing that has helped the most, in my opinion. A lot of people feel alone when you're first diagnosed. I felt alone, and I was in Richmond, Virginia, so getting diagnosed in the South and being 25 years old, it was very alone. Like there wasn't clinics like when I moved to DC, it wasn't a system in place. It was one hospital that you went to and one clinic that you went to. And so everybody who tested positive was all in the same room.
Right.
When you went,
somebody
somebody to know, you didn't go to the room, and I didn't for a while. And so it's really about like reiterating that to them, and like, and actually, like you said, like going through stats, going through figures, and letting them open up and ask like any question. Because disclosure comes up. Do you still have sex comes up? I get that question a lot. Like, well, do you still? It's like, yes, I have sex regularly. Like, I know, like that's the first thing that goes through everybody's mind. Is like, oh, I'm not gonna be able to. Yeah, it's like, and it's not, and yeah. And I did too. Like when I first, because again, I wasn't educated as educated as I am now around everything, and so yeah.
Or I had to date positive people only,
Yeah.
and I thought I had to date only positive people, but then I was like, why would I want to? Because they're out and I'm not out. And also, too, because even, just the whole being out thing, just if I, were to talk to someone younger or newly diagnosed, because, like George, I have, mentees too. I was even surprised even heterosexual people, especially men, come to me and talk about, being testing positive and all those things, which to this day still blows my mind. But, as far as the disclosure, I mean, just like any other part of your life, you have the freedom to talk about whatever aspect of your life with whoever. And then when it comes to HIV, if you feel like you're having sex that could be transmittable, where HIV could potentially transmit, I feel like it's fair to have that conversation.
Folks that don't understand those terms, having sex that where it could be transmittable, what does that mean in plain speak?
So, I would say unsafe sex, but sex without a condom. Okay. Yeah, sex without a condom. So, because for me, if you're making love and all that stuff, it ain't unsafe. It's just, you're just not using a condom. So, and then also too, like, when I look at like our peers, our brothers, or people we looked up to, look up to, who have been out for a long time. And mind you, I was diagnosed in 1999. I didn't come out publicly to the world until 2017, 2016. I forget which year it was, but it was on World AIDS Day that day. And I just say, you know what? Oh, no, I'm sorry. It was 2017 because I was supposed to do it on 2016 because I said, I feel like I could talk about it freely once I turned 40, which was in 2016. For some reason, I didn't do it. So when I talked about it in 2017, I was surprised. Even in 2017, I was surprised as far as the acceptance, encouragement, all those things, especially from heterosexual people that I've known for all of my life, or most of my life. So yeah, but for anybody who's young, do it at your own comfort. This is a part of your life, just like anything else you want to talk about in your life that you're not most comfortable. But as far as the stigma and shame, I know another word that people say when they say, oh, well, I'm looking at two guys who lived with it for a long time, they looking great. It's not a glorification of it. It's just saying that this is not the end.
Yeah.
for two of us who thought it was the end when we were newly diagnosed. And I could speak for me throughout the 20 years, I went through ebbs and flows. Like for the first time, I'm going to mention, I've been in the AIDS category twice, as far as letting my health deteriorate because I went through a deep depression and didn't take care of myself. So I could speak to those people who, gone through, I don't need to take medicine because of how I'm feeling and stuff. And I was a waif in 2011. And in both times that I lost all the weight, got hospitalized near death with a single count CD4. Both times were supposed to be wake up calls, but I could talk on that and encourage those who are diagnosed. Like, I have experiences you don't want to go through. He has experience when we're just telling you this because we've been there. And we could just tell you, look, this ain't the end.
So I hear you saying two things I want to check. The first, when you talk about going into the HIV category, for me, that's an acknowledgement that a while ago there was a term that was used in the media. No one should ever use this term. I'm going to use it for this purpose because it's applicable, but it's what people would say is full-blown AIDS. And it's really what we refer to medically, it's stage 3 HIV, right? Yeah, so there was at the time when Oprah and others were talking about what it meant to be on the DL, and when the crisis was painted in ways that suggested that it was black gay men who were harbingers of the epidemic. What the media would say is that people have full-blown AIDS, in part because it conjures up this image of HIV being this thing that's bubbling up under your skin that at any point might ooze onto somebody else, right? And just think about the way that words matter. That's why we acknowledge the precision. But medically, what that refers to is stage 3 HIV, right? The point at which your count is so low that these other things are happening with you physiologically. And I say that just to acknowledge that, again, words matter. And a part of what we have to do to overcome the stigma is be more precise in the terms that we use, right?
And see, you're schooling me on something because even my own doctors didn't address it.
See, how about that? And then similarly, when George talked about the stigma that some of us experience when confronted with this idea that we should know better, we should do better, it came up for me when I talked to my friends about PrEP and being on PrEP. And their response was essentially, right, if you're a black gay man, MSM, whatever the category the CDC would use, I use same gender loving because gay is a white male political identifier. Their response was, well, if you know the risk, then you shouldn't just be having sex, right? Which is a thing, however, I'm not signing up for that, right? You can say it about anything, and I didn't even want to go into the how unfair it is that no one else asked this question of themselves, but you will say it to a black gay man. But the point that I really want to underscore is that what we now know based on the data is that in spite of black people, black gay men in particular, being disproportionately affected by HIV, it's not because we engage in riskier sex. In fact, we are more protected when it comes to using contraceptives and other forms of protection. It's that we live in communities where we are least likely to have access to culturally competent doctors, where we don't have access to the kinds of resources that come with moving to a neighborhood like Chelsea, California, or a place that's going to give you access to a clinic and PrEP and support groups where you can have these kinds of conversations. And so we have to be clear about that so that people don't place an undue burden upon themselves or otherwise succumb to the pressure of stigma and shame. So making those points makes me now go back to when you started to talk about religiosity and acknowledging that now, while being homosexual is no longer a category within the DSM, the diagnostic manual that
I'm sorry, what's DSM?
DSM is a diagnostic manual that psychologists use to determine mental health disorders. And so there was a period of time that just ended recently where homosexuality was thought to be a mental disorder. That is now no longer a mental disorder, but religious trauma is a mental disorder. And when you were speaking about the shame and the stigma, I thought about the Tyler Perry movie with Brandy. I can't think of which one it is, but I know they're in Atlanta.
With Kim Kardashian and all of them.
All of them. Temptation, where again, the lesson in that movie was the thing that you get, she wasn't a black gay man, but the thing that you get for not doing what God wants you to do is HIV, right? And that's very much a thing. So I want both of you to speak to maybe the three biggest myths or things that people get wrong about HIV in the black community. Like, are there things that you just wish people knew that they would stop saying? and that we could otherwise move past when it comes to this topic.
Oh God, I was hoping George would go first.
Keep going to George.
Okay, that's fine. So 3 stigmas or myths.
Just the biggest myths that we should address and bust.
I just want to speak on it from a gay perspective instead of everyone. I would have to say just to gay men in particular that here we go. Okay, so one of the things that had bothered me for a long time, and I'm sure I'll probably get flacked or I'll be called shaming for it, is that I'll say the better part of this decade, the breeding culture has been popularized, and
So for folks that don't know what that is.
Right. Okay. So I learned about this in 2009, and my mouth just dropped. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is what I learned. It's supposed to be purposely HIV people are passing HIV or something like can y'all explain it?
Keep going.
Because the way I first heard it, and the definition has changed, is that first of all, it's raw sex, bareback sex, no condom. And then it's supposed to be knowingly or desiring, because you may not always do it, pass on HIV to each other.
Okay.
But then also too, we have websites where actually, in my opinion, the majority of porn today is, they promote raw sex.
Next, yeah.
And okay, so let me leave that alone. But I feel like that is part of the issue, part of the problem. I would like to see I don't mind the lifestyle. I would like to see more responsibility talked about it. Like, I don't know if you've watched porn as long as I have. I've been watching it since the 90s. And back in the 90s when black workout was a thing, Gene Lamar, Bobby Blake, they were all the thing back then. And back in those days, they gave you the warning about safe sex. So after then, it was just up to you whether you wanted to participate, but just letting you know this is for entertainment, but we do promote safe sex, and when you don't do safe sex, these are the consequences. Another thing is, just a point that we were talking about earlier, the shame and such. We have many things in our lives that doesn't go well for us. I mean, no matter how long you live, anything can happen. So when it comes to being HIV positive, I'm not saying, just dust it off your shoulder like it's nothing. I mean, as long as you decide to take care of it like you would any other illness, try not to. I'm not going to tell you what you should do, but try not to live in the stigma and the shame. You don't have to. That's your choice if you want to. You take it from 2 people who've lived with it for a long time and many others who have lived it for a long time. And hear our stories, hear how we mentor other people. The last thing is one of the topics when we discuss shaming within the community is we want to be so self-righteous when it comes to disclosure. I know there's a popular vlogger out there who I'm cool with, but the community at large isn't cool with, because all he harps about is, HIV positive men and the stats and such like that. Don't let those voices make you feel shame in who you are and what you have going on in your life, especially being HIV positive. There's so many other people who could empower you as you walk in your life and let you know that, baby, that's just a part of you. That doesn't define you. That's not going to be the end or the death of you.
Right. 3 myths. I would say, I don't even know if this ain't really a myth, but more of a correction, that AIDS and HIV aren't interchangeable words. I think that's one of the bigger issues that we deal with, because you'll hear people say like, oh, that's the AIDS building, or like, can I get an AIDS test, or just in the work that I do, and I'm always like having to correct people. So again, it goes back to like that whole, I guess, language and like clean versus dirty, and just like terms and terminology.
That's something we stop saying. It's clean and dirty.
And so I think like there's a myth there. I think built in like, oh, these people are clean versus these people being dirty, and I think all of that needs to change. Something kind of to what Wadey was talking about around breeding. I mean, breeding, from what I know, is just like it's more so like a different term for cream pie, which is which is just a different term sexually for just ejaculating within somebody, and that's really what that's all that breeding is. Yeah, it was and I mean, now that's not to say that there aren't like who engage in that, or that I've not heard that rumor that some people do that, but that's not what breeding is, so to speak. So I would say that people need to be more educated around like those terms and what like breeding is and everything. Especially because, some people don't think, or I guess one of the myths that still happens is around like you can get it from saliva. That's one of those things that I'm always working with people to understand, like, no, you can't contract HIV through saliva, but you can contract it through pre-cum. And so teaching people around that, because a lot of people will have condom sex but give oral sex raw. And so you have to really teach people like, well, if you're going to do oral sex raw, then you have to understand there's still a risk there, because if a person pre-ejaculates in your mouth and you have an open sore or you have a cut in your mouth, even though the risk is lower, it still is a risk there. And I think the last myth would probably be around tops not contracting the virus at rates that bottoms do. Like I get why that became a myth, but I understand how it became a myth. And again, it probably is a lot more truth that people who are bottoms probably contracted at a high rate only because there's more tissue and more blood in an anal canal than there is for a person through the urethra. So it's like, I get it scientifically, but it's like there was a myth at one time that tops could not contract HIV, and so it's like putting dead to that myth. Like anybody who is having sex can contract HIV. Oh, and I guess the last thing would be, again, goes back to like terminology, like just destroying the word safe sex. I know a lot of times what we're shifting to is safer sex, because it's like, and we don't just say like having safer sex, we say these are safer sex practices. And it's just simply to put out there that, there are ways that you can practice sex to reduce risk. And so like we often teach harm reduction. So it's like these are just harm reduction tools and techniques, because again, like if you're still giving oral sex without a condom, then there's still going to be a risk there, right? And so a lot of people will say, oh, I only have safe sex, and then you literally, when you ask them like, oh, well, do you suck dick without a condom? And like, it's like, of course.
Actually, then.
And a lot of people, they don't think about that. They really don't. It doesn't register to them, because for a lot of us, oral sex became foreplay because that was just a given. It was just a given. And people who also, I didn't want to say eat ass, but we'll say eat ass. I was trying to say like toss salad or toss. I was like, well, what's a nice way? I was like anal sex. I mean, like anal. I was trying to find, but I was like, I'll just say it. But like, because there's still, you can still contract. Maybe not necessarily like HIV, but you can still contract STIs from doing that as well. So like I think like dispelling a lot of those myths is very important.
Super important. STIs, for those who don't know, is sexually transmitted infections. The CDC updated the term because they're not all diseases. Some of them are infections. So that is just that term. We also, there was something else you mentioned when we talked about safe sex, but I will come back.
I just want to add one more too. A myth, or not even a myth, but a behavior that I would like to see go away when it comes around HIV in our community or wherever, it doesn't even matter, is the how did you get it? I even remember just.
You don't want people to ask that question?
Or it doesn't even matter, because you still have it.
Okay.
Or there's like a hierarchy, like if you got it from a lover versus you got it from being at orgies, or being a drug user, or all of these other things. I mean, regardless, like we say, certain things don't see color. I mean, neither does HIV. It doesn't see activity or behavior. The only activity it sees is the passing from one to another.
I love that. Appreciate that. And you talked about hearing our story, so just wanted to lift up the Counter Narrative Project. Native Son and the work that Emil Wilbekin is doing, as well as David Bridgeforth, folks that provide platforms, amongst others. That list is not exhaustive. They just came to me, but folks that provide platforms to share these kinds of stories and others. You mentioned porn, and I've had a number of conversations with folks connected to not only porn, but shows that we consume like Insecure, where people are engaging in, I won't say a lot, but sex, without regard for condoms in particular. And for me, it's been this interesting thing, talking about being on PrEP, why I'm on PrEP, encouraging people to take PrEP. And interesting enough, I found that for me on profiles, people, I think to a lesser extent, are doing the clean, dirty thing, but the stand-in for that is, are you on PrEP? Right? And then my concern now is that there are people that are talking about being on PrEP who actually are not on PrEP because it has become this like silver bullet for folks. And then there's also this feeling that like, I can now, right, that too, but I can have sex without regard for what other people are doing to protect their health and well-being and mine because I'm taking this pill that will significantly reduce the likelihood of me getting HIV, so that if I become infected with any sexually transmitted infection, it's curable, more likely than not. And if I become HIV positive, then I can sue Gilead, right? Which again is problematic, but it is moving us further down the line of having conversations about safer sex. So if we could talk a little bit about maybe what it means for us to consume media that celebrates sex without thinking about some of what we've talked about, right? Having conversations with partners, using forms of prevention and protection, whether that be PrEP or condoms, or otherwise doing what's required to ensure that as you move along the continuum of care, you're healthy.
Dang, I didn't want to go first on this one because I'm still thinking about the thought I had earlier about, just the celebrating of breeding, especially in porn culture or the porn industry. Wow.
So stay there. What does it mean for us to move from an era where the behavior was the same, but there was at least an acknowledgement at the beginning that there was a disclaimer to say that this is entertainment and we are, at least as professionals, are mindful of health and wellness. To have that now go away.
So to what you said, I would appreciate that, but then at the same time, I'm sure there's somebody who will say, well, still, you're a consenting adult, so you choose to have it, the consequences, this is 2019, blah, blah, blah. I just still feel that if you have a public platform, well, no, because I have a public platform too, and somebody could apply that to me. So, that's the thing is when we speak on these issues, we do have to be careful of what we say because words do have meaning. At the same time, we speak to our own truths, even if it's not a good pill for other people to swallow, but also to make sure intentions are specified. So I have to say my intention specified here is just, okay, I'm gonna just go there. With our community as Black, gay, queer, SGL men, what bothers me when it comes to this topic is we've had similar conversations earlier about representation, but I do feel that when it comes to our entertainment, and I know we have TV stars and all this stuff, but I'm talking about local, from our nightlife to even media, that bareback porn and just raw porn, all of these things has become like our celebrities. Like even it was in the 90s before we had people that represented us on television or before we even could have an online media platforms where we could be bloggers and writers for all these amazing, huge outlets. It's been a concern of mine since I've been in the community since the 90s.
Are you saying that there's a hierarchy and we celebrate folks who engage in raw or unprotected sex?
Yeah, it's like they become our celebrities,
okay.
As far as when we look at our nightlife. When we look at our nightclubs, the promotions, even I'm sorry to say, it even affects or even it's been part of like our Black prides. And I'm not saying it's all of our Black prides, but when it comes to the nightlife part, and we give, the promoters, it's like, look, our entertainments are XYZ strippers when we have all of these singers and rappers and, talented people, or even our TV stars could come through and, and it's nothing. And I know I'm gonna get, oh, he's trying to shame the sex. No, I'm not shaming. I'm just saying it's more to us than that.
So acknowledging that, what do you want to see happen with them?
So I kind of, and the reason why I went there is because I think it unintentionally, because I don't think this is purposely at all, I think it unintentionally promotes the culture of risky, I hate that word risky, and I know we're not using safe and unsafe because I don't like it either, but you guys know what I mean, raw sex, bareback sex. And with that, we know what consequences come to that. No, we don't need to beat down everybody with the education and teach them, but there needs to be reminders. There needs to be that balance. And I'm just, even this day, it's not even just porn stars. We got people who are trying to be porn stars off of Twitter and upload their stuff on Pornhub, and now Facebook is getting it and Instagram is getting it. So, it's really commonplace. I could go on, but...
No, it makes sense to me. And again, I think about so many of the conversations I had with my friends around Insecure, the first season of Insecure. And how frequently people were engaging in sex, because that's what folks do when they're young professionals and you grown, but not thinking about or having conversations about condoms. So if Issa and the crew are watching, maybe let's consider this a note and figure out ways that we can offer up reminders.
It's funny because with Insecure, I was one of the first people to write about that issue. If I wasn't it was either I was the first or the second person to write about it, but it was something I had noticed. And what I talked about primarily in my article is that a lot of times Black women don't realize how much the epidemic affects them because they don't see it as that. And they did address it though, because Issa said they were going to address it in. I haven't seen, the show hasn't been on in so long. It's like I can't even think, but. Someone did contract an STI on one of the episodes, the third season. Yeah, it was the third season. Yeah, he contracted the STI, and so they did have an episode that talked about reckless sex and where it could. I don't even want to say reckless, but yeah, it's like a reckless sex and where it could lead. Right. But again, it's like I guess in terms of when you use like even the term like reckless, I think I want to speak more to like oftentimes we talk about the symptoms. Like we don't talk about the root cause. Like the root cause is that we haven't built a culture that is able to have conversations about sex, because elementary school makes it taboo, middle school makes it taboo, high school makes it taboo, and then a lot of us learn sex through porn. Right. So you also have to realize that porn is a teaching tool. So I don't always want to I don't get so caught up in like the whole bareback or anything about like porn so much, because I know it's still the only teaching tool that most kids have to even know what sex is, because they don't learn it traditionally in school systems. They're not learning it from their parents. Nobody really talks to them about it. You don't talk about it in the church. So it's like most of your institutions want to push it away. And so in terms of like just like porn and like I've had sex with porn stars, so like that's nothing to me, right? And so it's like no, and I've talked about it though, like but I've talked about it publicly. Like I've had sex with porn stars. I talk with porn stars all the time. Like they'll DM me all the time because, and I get like how they are seen as like, and it's interesting too, right? Because it's like it's celebrity light, because they're not really seen as celebrities to the outside world, right? It's a very small segment of people, and they're not even as far as like seen as celebrities, they're just recognizable, in my opinion, right? Because it's like, it doesn't give them like celebrity perks, they don't get car service, they don't get, and a lot of them will tell you like that, and a lot of them will tell you like, I still have to work a regular job and do this, or I do work a regular job and I have an OnlyFans, and I'm not so mad at them simply because like when you know like the other set of circumstances that surround Black queer people getting jobs and getting education and getting other things, it just doesn't bother me as much, especially because like we watch a whole industry where we know sex sells for every other community, and when we tried to empower ourselves in sex sells, HIV became the issue. Right. So it's like I understand like it's a double-edged sword, and so I'll never have an issue with. I just don't have an issue with it. And I also want to talk about like the fact that a lot of our porn is raw sex. I don't necessarily have a big issue with the raw sex component. Again, I think that's a symptom, and that's the after part, right? I want to know, did y'all talk first? Right? Because if you had the conversation first, then right, or did you make a conscious decision to disclose? Did y'all make a conscious decision to talk about when y'all last were tested? Did you make the conscious decision to say I'm undetectable? Okay, well I'm on PrEP. Like, did that conversation happen before the raw sex? Because then if I watched 100 pornos that had raw sex, but they all 100 of them had a conversation before, there's no there should be no reason that I should be upset at two consenting adults making that decision, right? Because we don't have to have that conversation around hetero porn. We don't have to have that conversation around any other porn categories except ours, but that's only because HIV gets infused into every single aspect of our lives. And so I do think that porn is a powerful tool. Like I said, it's a teaching tool, but I also think that it's powerful in the sense that it shows us as humans, and it shows us as fully human, and it doesn't show us as like people who have to always like. I hate that HIV has to always be in the back of our mind. I hate that, and I hate that it doesn't have to sit in the back of other people's minds. And I also hate that when people watch us having sex, that it sits in their minds, and they're always throwing that dagger, and like we can't. And again, I think it's sad because most people would just like say, oh, your porn shouldn't look like this, right? But then if your issue was just about how our porn looked, then why are you showing up to when we go party with HIV testing trucks? Then why are you, when we have a brunch, it's sponsored by pharmaceutical companies? Then why are you, when we have any single thing, it's always around that? So your issue isn't just with the way we have sex. Your issue is literally with our existence, because in every single part of our existence, y'all find a way to show up in a way that's not beneficial to the totality of who we are. And I think it goes back to, like you said, I don't want to be reduced to my body parts, and I don't want us to be reduced to just our sex. And let us have sex, let us have fun somewhere, because we don't get to have it everywhere else. Yeah. And so, like, if that's the one thing that we can do to pleasure ourselves and not feel like we have to be so burdened with, again, our problem we didn't create, then I don't have an issue with it. But I do want us to also start having conversations, and even if we start depicting what those conversations look like more, and even if you depicted them in porn, I wouldn't even have an issue. I think it would be dope to start seeing porn stars talk about it, yeah. And right, like before they had sex, ask that question. Yeah. Because I think a lot of people will be like, well, okay, right. So that's what it actually looks like when y'all disclose. I don't have a problem with that. I really, really don't. Yeah.
You're actually, if I may, just
yeah, of course.
I love George. You already know I love hearing you talk, because you always like provoke stuff to come out of me. So I'm gonna try to make 3 quick bullet points. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna be long-winded. So bullet point number 1, because I'm trying to figure out which is first, because you were talking about just it being everywhere present in our society, our small society, right? And it made me think about a thought that I just had. I'm 43, right? Been HIV positive since almost 23 years old. And that was 1999. The first time that I was out in the community in like a space, which was a gay bar in Kansas City, that was 1996. And by 1999, I dated my first relationship. I was in my first relationship, which is where I contracted. And I realized most of my life as a black gay man has been an HIV positive black gay man. And I'm trying to remember, what was it like those 2 years and little change? What was it like when I didn't have to think about I'm HIV positive in our spaces? I just been thinking about that for like the last couple of weeks or so. It just, dawned on me. And then, when we're talking about just the popularity of bareback porn, the reason why I had such a hard time articulating what I'm saying, because really was the two longest problems that I had with it. It's not as much the popularity, it's what goes on in it. Now, I can't prove this, so I'm just speculating. One, and because you brought it up, that's why I love hearing you talk, so I'd rather you go first on this stuff because you pull bullet points out of me. One, you were talking about the how it's compared, HIV talk is compared with heterosexuals versus homosexuals. And from what I know, testing is much more prevalent, or it's much more of a requirement in heterosexual spaces than homosexuals. Because even when I remember mentoring in the 2000s a couple of young boys that dealt with, I'm not going to say the name of the porn company because they've been trying to sue me a couple of times for blogging about it back in those days, but
Find the blog.
they couldn't. Oh no, that part was discontinued. Yeah, but yeah, so. And so I was bothered by their two testimonies and stuff, and how I had to help. Well, I didn't have to. I chose to help them to go back to their homes. So if you want to know which porn company it used to be based in Chicago until they got kicked out and had to move to Miami. Now y'all do y'all's research and figure out who I'm talking about, or some part of Florida. I don't know if it was Miami, but also that drew me to this other point where where my deep rooted issue with this is, and the reason why I got into this whole legal situation with that company in particular was because you got black gay stars, but they're not ran by black men. Some of them are now, but especially at that point, and even the ones that are most popular today, they're not ran by black men. So I feel like I know this.
It's still exploitation.
Yeah, so today we talked about the whole Ed Buck situation, even though that's not HIV related. It just, when I see stories like that, it triggers me. And so that's why I was like, I wanted to say something I couldn't articulate, but I'm glad you pulled that out of me.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I'm glad you mentioned Ed Buck. Shout out to Jasmine Canick, who's been an unrelenting advocate and ally to the community to get justice there. We don't know what role HIV might play, right? I wonder now, as I'm thinking about this, whether or not the autopsies checked for both Jamel and I'm forgetting and Timothy. And this is a question we should be asking now that there is another brother who literally escaped death at the home of a white man who still was walking around without impunity before last night. But actually, this is appropriate because so many of our conversations about black people, black queer people, black gay people are mired in the trauma that we have to reconcile and reckon with every single day, not to a fault of our own, but because of what we've been born into. And I appreciate you, George, for offering up and including joy in that, right? That we need to be more mindful about, not apologizing when we experience joy, and seeking out spaces where we can be joyful. And so as we land this plane, acknowledging that y'all have prompted like 5 other things that I want to ask about, but we should just do this again. What's the charge that you have for people? Again, acknowledging that we're sitting down to talk about National Gay Men's HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, really hopefully to create space and provide another teaching tool in addition to porn. If y'all know porn that has consensual conversations, send it to us for research purposes only, of course. But acknowledging that this can also serve as a teaching tool. What's your charge? What do you want people to do, black people to do, black queer men to do, given all that we've talked about and all that you know to be true?
The charge I would give is for us to just start having conversations, us to have meaningful conversations around sex and be accountable in our own sex. Like, we're responsible for self first. And so when you go into that room, or when you go for that hookup, or you go into that relationship, to be empowered to ask the right questions because you want to protect yourself, and to not feel like you're going to make someone feel bad because you're asking the question about their status. So that would be my first charge. And my second charge would be to we have to stop making HIV such a taboo subject. We have to stop shaming positive people within the community. We already know what the statistics say, that 50% of us will likely contract the virus over our lifetime. When you have a daunting statistic like that, the only way you can survive it or beat it is if you're a unified front against it. So there's no use in shaming trying to shame us out of contracting the virus. I know a lot of people think shaming is a tool. It's not a tool. It's not an effective tool. It's not a tool that has ever worked. Again, the epidemic is much larger than us. The epidemic was not created by us, but it is our fight and it is our burden to carry. And I also want to charge people who are not positive to get more involved in the fight. A lot of the burden of teaching people how to stay negative rests upon the shoulders of those who are already positive. And as somebody who has been HIV positive for nearly 9 years, it's a daunting task because I'm always, not only am I educating positive people, I have to educate sexual partners. I have to educate when you get into a relationship. A lot of times with someone who's negative, they don't often have the tools or the vocabulary or the knowledge around HIV because they've never had to go through the four meetups with their doctor a year, never had to go through the testing, never had to go through the blot, the Western blot, like all of the terminology that you learn just from being positive. You don't have to go through that. But again, the fight has to start to also rest upon the shoulders of those who have not contracted the virus, but have done the work and done what they needed to do to not contract the virus. And they need to be more vocal or as vocal as the people who are HIV positive who seem to be the torch carrier. Sometimes we just need to be able to share the load. And so, yeah, I would just charge everyone in our community to start sharing the load.
I hear you saying we're all in this together. And how can people find you and your work and additional thoughts that you have on the range of topics that we've discussed?
You can find me at I am GM Johnson on Twitter as well as on Instagram. I'm just George M. Johnson on Facebook. I don't use it as much because Facebook is just a different, it's like Facebook gets the news 2 weeks later, so it's like a different territory. And my website is imgmjohnson.com. I guess final thoughts on everything that we've discussed. I think we need to start having more conversations like this, but I also think that places with larger platforms, Black publications in particular, need to start allowing us to have these spaces and these rooms, but not just with our community as the Black queer, as representatives of parts of the Black queer community, because I don't want to say as the Black queer community, but there needs to be space created on national platforms and on national media where we can bring us in the room and trans people in the room, as well as heterosexual people in the room, to actually have the real discussion around it. Because what you'll end up seeing is that we're more connected than we thought, and that HIV ties us together, as do many other epidemics. And so a lot of people want to be Black first until it's time to be Black first. And so if we're going to be Black first, then you have to realize that HIV is something that affects the entire Black community, and it has to come first in conversations when we're all in rooms together, because it's not just a health issue, it's a social justice issue.
Work.
Okay, so what was the first question again?
What's your charge to people?
Yes. Oh, okay. So again, this is why I love following after him, because he said 2 words that I love living by, and I always hope that what I do with my platform does is speak on accountability and empowerment. More than ever, and when it comes to whether you're positive or negative, or I want to speak to those who are positive. We say that, yes, you could live a long time, you take care of yourself, making sure that not only you take care of yourself with your meds, but also, too, how you feel, where your mind is, where your emotions are, who you are around, and just how you live your love life, or how you live your sex life, because I know those 2 things are exclusive. So, be empowered in that, and be empowered in those things to take care of yourself. I'm speaking from someone who went through 10 years of depression, and throughout those 10 years of depression, I had those moments where I almost died because I didn't take care of myself. And, some people don't call it, attempted suicide. For me, those were moments of attempted suicide. So, it's more than just the disease itself. It's everything that you do with it. And also, too, and take care of it just like it's any other health ailment or health issue. Because I don't want to make it sound like, oh, it's no problem, like it's something glorious, but also, just like cancer, you have to take care of yourself. Just like, asthma, anything else, like, just make sure you take care of it. See your doctor, speak to your peers, speak to leaders who, who have the education, because I'm being educated. I mean, mind you, I've been 20 years HIV positive, but I did not, half of it, I didn't even want to acknowledge it, or at least publicly, but definitely didn't even want to acknowledge it internally. So you're hearing different voices as far as the walks of life when it comes to this. Also, too, something else I just cannot stress enough is the how did you get it? It doesn't matter. It's just because being HIV positive is just being HIV positive. We talked about, the shaming of the clean versus dirty or top versus bottom. How did you get it? There's no hierarchy in it because we all still have to take medication for it or to be able to sustain it. So those are the two charges that I just want to put out there, among many, but those are the two main ones to me. And then also for those of you who are new to me, I'm Wadey G. My blog is called theglisted.com. My social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter are the G Listed. Facebook, I ran out a number of friends, so it doesn't bother me. Oh, wait, but fan page is the G Listed as well. So, I need Facebook. so I'm like, oh my God, but also too, there's so many other resources that you could find out there on social media. I mean, it's just you and a computer or you and your device. So if you don't feel like talking to anyone, just be empowered and be responsible, be accountable to yourself before you even be accountable to anyone else to look up the information that you need.
I love that. Three things. One, I want to say thank you to each of you, George and Wadey, my brothers, in the work and in this movement. I know that as we continue to stress in this space, that talking about this is not easy. And it's not lost on me that after a very long day that both of you showed up here fully present and that you're talking about things that you acknowledge you haven't disclosed before. And that, again, I know cannot be easy. So if you hear me say nothing else, hear me when I say thank you. I want to encourage everyone to leverage, as has been said, all of the resources that exist. We said a lot. We offered up a lot of terms. We all also know, again, that so many people put off and are scared of having this conversation because they don't have the language. So I want to encourage everyone to visit nbjc.org and download our Words Matter HIV Toolkit, which will literally give you some of the words that we've talked about, and it'll list the things that you shouldn't say, the things that you should say, and otherwise encourage you to engage in activities to make these conversations very real. The point that I like to offer up is that each of us have something that we don't want to talk about or disclose, especially on a date. It could be your credit score, your family's history of mental health. It could be your HIV status. The most important thing is that we find the language to have the conversation in ways that are safe and that are supported. And so leverage the tools that exist for that. If you do not in this moment know your status, or if you are not connected to care and you do know your status, we want to change that. So if you also go to our website and put in your zip code, you can find places where you can access PrEP, and PEP, which are two different things that should be applied in two different ways. One is pre-exposure to HIV and one is post-exposure to HIV. But you can also find connections to care. And so if you do nothing else, get tested, know your status, and have conversations with people so that we can all get free, which for me means healthy, happy, and whole. We should do this again soon, but we'll sign off for now. And again, encourage everybody to do something to celebrate National Gay Men's HIV/AIDS Awareness Day in this year. To be continued.